Greetings, sisters and brothers, comrades, friends. Welcome to African History Club. This is episode number 31. I'm your host, Milton Alimadi. So today I'm going to keep it contemporary. I will be just talking about the situation in Chad. Chad, which is in central, northern Africa. It's actually very strategically located with neighbors in West Africa, neighbors in North Africa, neighbors in terms of neighboring countries in Central Africa. So Chad is your typical neocolonial African state. It is a neocolony of France. And it's been in the news lately after the killing of the dictator of 31 years, General Idris Deby. So I will get into that in 1 minute. But also I just want to let friends and comrades know that April the 27th was the first year anniversary of the passing of my beloved sister, Barbara Ali-Mahdi, who was an activist and freedom fighter in her own right in Uganda. And this weekend, May the 2nd actually, was the anniversary of her burial. So we had a Zoom memorial with friends of Barbara's who were here in the United States, friends in Britain, and friends in Uganda. And it was hosted in Uganda. And, it was very therapeutic for myself, my siblings, and all of Barbara's friends and people that admired the work she did in Uganda in terms of leading protests against the dictatorship. And any friend that wants to know more about Barbara and the work she did, you can Google Barbara Ali-Mahdi. You just general Google search or put Google and then look up under news. Or you can also put Barbara Ali-Mahdi and Milton Ali-Mahdi if anybody is interested. And we also launched a foundation in her name on May the 2nd. And information about that is also online in case anybody is interested in supporting the foundation. The foundation will be offering scholarships to focusing on young girls with stellar academic records from high school, offering them scholarships for college in Uganda. So we already actually sponsored our first student, a young lady by the name of Jennifer Akello, is already actually attending a college called Kyambogo College in Uganda. All right, so back to today's presentation. So when Idris Deby's death was reported on the BBC, when I first read it on the BBC, I was highly skeptical, and for very obvious reasons. On April the 20th, the BBC reported that the Chadian military had engaged in combat with rebels. They have the acronym FACT, F-A-C-T. It's French, so it doesn't match when you translate the French to English acronyms. But it stands for Chadians for new change or new dispensation. So anyway, in that battle, 300 insurgents were killed, according to the report in the BBC, obviously coming from the Chadian military junta or regime. And 150 of these insurgents captured, and only 5 government soldiers killed. So it's your typical propaganda piece. And out of those 5 soldiers, one of them happened to be the dictator himself, President Idris Deby, which was, of course, to me, immediately preposterous. And I tweeted that could not the authorities come up with a better story to peddle? So anyway, that was the initial report. And I've been doing some reporting, speaking to a lot of people from Chad and the activist community. And they say that, in fact, is not how Idris Deby died. He apparently was killed, according to the Chadians that I've spoken with. They had election on April the 11th. In fact, the results of the election was announced on April the 19th, the day before Deby was killed. So according to the Chadians that I've spoken with, he was actually killed in retaliation because just before the elections, there was one candidate who was barred from running, and his name is Yaya Dilo Jeru. He was disqualified from running by the Supreme Court. And in a country like Chad, the Supreme Court, of course, would be a mouthpiece for the dictator himself. So he was disqualified. And then when soldiers were sent to arrest him, his elderly mother was killed in the process. And he also happens to be prominent. In fact, he's related to Deby himself. They're actually cousins, which meant his mother was actually Deby's aunt. So he killed his own aunt. And apparently, well, according to these Chadian activists, people who were also influential and sided with the aunt and this candidate who was barred are the ones who actually killed Deby. But that is not the focus of this conversation today. The focus is to look at how the neocolonial domination of Africa, and Chad today is like a microcosm of the affliction which bedevils many African nations, the continued outside control and domination of the politics and economics by the former colonial powers. France dominating most of its former colonies in West Africa, and in this case, Central North Africa, Chad, and the British still dominating its former colonies as well, whether it's in South East Africa, like Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania. But today our focus is on Chad. So France dominates the economy. Chad has resources. Chad has oil. Chad has uranium. And Chad has gas. And Chad also loans its army on behalf of France so that France can police African countries such as Mali, for example. And that is why France is keenly involved in what is ongoing in Chad. So, for example, after Deby was killed, whether he was assassinated in retaliation or whether he died allegedly on the front line in heroic battle, regardless of how he died, they have a constitution which calls for the Speaker of the National Assembly to take over as president. But did that happen? No. The military, it's a military regime. Even under Deby, it's, the military sometimes wearing civilian attire, very similar to Uganda, for example, where you have dictator Museveni there for 35 years. Sometimes he dons his uniforms, carries a gun around. Sometimes he wears suits when he's meeting, for example, with the IMF or World Bank. So the same thing with Deby. So the speaker was blocked from becoming president by the military. The military ignored the constitution and installed his son, named Mahamat Deby, 37 years old, as the transitional president. And Chadians have been protesting on the streets of Chad in N'Djamena, the capital, and about 12 people, and I say 12 because the reports are not consistent. The regime says 9 people, and activists say 12 people were killed. So let's go with the figure of 12 killed for demonstrating, protesting against the military trying to continue the military regime. So they came out and they protested. But France is backing the military. Obviously, France would prefer to have a military regime in Chad because France has been controlling the army, the military. So why risk having a civilian administration that actually wants Chad to be independent? So the French president, Macron, went to the funeral services of President Deby, and obviously giving an endorsement to this new regime led by Mahamat Deby, which is doing a number of things. It's undermining democratization in Chad. Number 2, it is destroying the Constitution of Chad. Can you imagine if a military regime took power in France? Would the people of France, would Macron want outsiders to support the military takeover in France? Of course not. So why is it that somehow there's supposed to be a lower standard in Africa? It just goes back to the neo-imperialism of France, which is, by the way, being very vigorously resisted now, not only in Chad, but in other West African countries as well. And France is also destroying the African Union. The African Union has not been effective for the last few years because of France's intervention and influence over the African Union. The African Union has a clause which is unambiguous. If a country, a member country, if the government of a member country is taken over by the military, then automatically that country is suspended from membership of the African Union. And that triggers a lot of sanctions, including trade. And it is meant to check the military in African countries and to keep them in the barracks. But now you have Macron essentially endorsing this military takeover, which of course could not have occurred had it not been pre-approved by France, you see? And that is why young people now in many African countries, the former French colonies, have been very vigorous in resisting French influence in the region. A couple of weeks ago, there were protests in Senegal, in Dakar, the capital, and French businesses were actually targeted for attacks and destruction by these angry young people who were increasingly very resentful of France always still trying to support the old establishment in African countries, these corrupt leaders who imposed themselves for many years in African countries, and rather than serving the interest of the citizens of the individual African countries, they serve the interest of empire, imperialism, and neocolonialism. So now Mahamat Deby has been imposed as the quote-unquote president in Chad. That he is supposed to be the chairman of a transitional military council for a period of 18 months. And many of the Chadians that I've spoken with and interviewed have their serious doubts. And why is this? Because when his father, Idris Deby, seized power in 1990, he said he was going to be a transitional leader for 3 months. And he ended up there for 31 years. And that's why Chadians don't believe that Mahamat Deby means it when he says that he is going to have a transitional administration of only 18 months and then presumably go back to the barracks. So that's very unlikely. It's likely that the military, with the support of France, wants to use this period to stifle and eliminate authentic civil society resistance. And then here's the other issue in terms of what's going on in Chad. The military under Deby, Idris Deby, had been fighting against insurgents, as I mentioned in the beginning. And this is a coalition of about 4 rebel groups. And many of them include young fighters who are actually not professional fighters. Many are actually civilians who have now taken up arms because they believe that is the only way to get rid of the military regime in Chad. And now you have France, the French military, because France has a military presence in Chad as well. So now you have the French military fighting alongside the Chadian military against these rebels who want to get rid of military regime in France. And France really does not operate alone when it comes to dominating the military in Chad and also fighting with them in other parts of North Africa, including in Mali as well. The United States is also involved in those operations, primarily in providing logistics, providing aircraft support, providing intelligence to these operations. And who are they fighting? They're fighting what are referred to as Islamists in that part of the continent, in North Africa. And how did they become powerful, these Islamists that they say they're fighting against? Well, lo and behold, it was in 2011, after NATO had destroyed the government of Muammar Gaddafi in Libya and unleashed all these weapons that Gaddafi had in his many military barracks all across Libya. And these weapons have now empowered all these multiple insurgencies that have spread all over West Africa as well as in North Africa. So this is, in fact, a French creation because the havoc, the killings that are ongoing in West Africa, in North Africa, as a result of Macron's predecessor, Sarkozy, and his determination, supported, of course, by the United States under then President Obama and NATO, to eliminate Gaddafi. And what was the alleged reason for the intervention in Libya? To prevent Gaddafi from, quote unquote, killing his own people. And how was that accomplished? By bombing Libya 24/7 for about 8 to 9 months, killing untold numbers of Libyans. We've never been told how many Libyans were killed, or to the extent of the multi-billion-dollar destruction of infrastructure, buildings, water sources, and other infrastructural facilities all across Libya. That has never been accounted for. So of course, there was a war crime. And now, the entire North African region, West African region, is paying the price of that. And that is one of the other reasons why France is really resented by the youth in many of these countries. So now, what is the solution for Chad in particular? Since today the focus is on Chad. Civil society seems to be very well organized right now in Chad, not only in Chad itself, but even in diaspora. They're very active on social media. They're very active in organizing protests. In France, in Paris, there have been many protests. In Canada, where they have a sizable population, many protests. And right here in the United States, in fact, there have been weekly protests at the French embassy in Washington, D.C. And I've met many of these Chadian activists, people in their 30s who are very determined. And one of them, whom I interviewed, is 37 and says, we are determined to get rid of French influence. We don't want neocolonial governments in Chad. We are inspired by people like Patrice Lumumba, who of course was the democratically elected Prime Minister of the Congo, who was murdered in the CIA and Belgium and United Kingdom plot shortly after independence in the 1960s. He said they're inspired by people like Thomas Sankara, another great Pan-African leader from Burkina Faso from 1983 to 1987, also murdered at the instigation of France because they wanted Burkina Faso and other African countries to be self-sufficient and independent, to produce their own food, produce their own clothing, build clinics, plant trees, build schools all over the country. And then what really got Sankara killed, of course, was when he attended what was then the Organization of African Unity meeting in July 1987, and he urged African countries to make a uniform demand collectively to renounce the debt, the foreign debt that was holding back development in Africa. And he said, if I do it alone, I won't be alive to attend next year's annual meeting. They'll kill me, but they cannot assassinate 54 African presidents. So please support me. None of them did. And his prediction came true in October the same year. So it didn't even live till the next year. Sankara was killed. And they say they're also inspired by Kwame Nkrumah, the great Pan-African leader and the first prime minister and later president of Ghana. So it seems like things are really changing this time in Chad. It seems like after going through the experience of 31 years of Idris Deby, that the people of Chad are not willing to endure anymore the continuation of this military regime, beholden to France and serving French interests rather than Chadian interests. It seems like they're not willing to take that anymore. I would not be surprised if this military regime does not survive. I have with me one of my favorite books, Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, the last stage of imperialism. And I've spoken about this book, of course, in the past. And some of you have actually told me that you've ordered the book as a result. I just want to read maybe 2 or 3 short parts from it. And you see how Nkrumah predicted the dilemma that Africa would experience and predicted the existence or the continuation of neocolonial states such as, Chad is only one example. Uganda is another example. And many other, most African countries, actually, I should say, if not all. The essence of neocolonialism is that the state which is subject to it is, in theory, independent and has all the outward trappings of international sovereignty. In reality, its economic system and thus its political policies directed from outside. That goes for Chad and other African countries. Where neocolonialism exists, the power exercising control is often the state, which formerly ruled the territory in question. There you go. In this case, France is exercising the power over Chad. Neocolonialism is also the worst form of imperialism. For those who practice it, it means power without responsibility. And for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress. Let me find maybe just one more part. Okay, this to me is one of the most critical aspects, and this covers pretty much every African country. Tragically, here, in the first place, the rulers of neo-colonial states derive their authority to govern not from the will of the people, but from the support which they obtain from their neo-colonial masters. They have therefore little interest in developing education, strengthening the bargaining power of their workers employed by expatriate firms, or indeed taking any step which would challenge the colonial pattern of commerce and industry, which it is the object of neocolonialism to preserve. There you go. That just, it sums it all up. And that's what we're seeing manifest in Chad. That's what we see occurring in other African countries, where the regime does not have to bother whether it has domestic legitimacy. So long as you can have a Macron endorsing you and stationing French soldiers in Chad, why do you have to bother with the electorate? And that is why when it was announced that he supposedly won another term, Idris Deby, they announced the day before he was actually killed, it was announced that he won with something like 80% or some nonsense like that. And in Uganda, you have dictator General Museveni, supported by the United States with $1 billion in taxpayer money annually and weapons, supported by the United Kingdom and supported by the EU. And they make their countries, they provide access to multinational corporations. And that is all they have to do. And then rent their troops. And as I said, Chad rented its army for operations in Mali, and Uganda rents its army for operations in Somalia to, quote unquote, preserve peace. So you have a person who is presiding over a terror regime in Chad, supposedly trying to preserve peace in Mali, and a person in Uganda operating a terror regime, supposedly trying to enforce peace in Somalia. And these are the contradictions that young Africans are increasingly rejecting, whether it's in Chad, whether it's in Uganda, whether it's in Senegal, as I just gave the example recently. And I'm very confident personally that the youth in Africa, increasingly conscious, I can tell that just by reading what is being posted on social media, listening to some of the interviews on independent channels, on YouTube, and reading the articles that they write and the vision that they have for the new Africa that I believe the young people will indeed create in Africa. So I'm very confident, and I'm very confident that neo-colonialism will at some point come to its last stage, to really affirm and deliver on the title of Nkrumah's book. I think this provides a good summary of what is ongoing in Chad. I want at some point to do a focus on on women in Africa, historically and contemporary as well. So that is going to be one of a couple of the episodes going forward. But when we have developing stories such as the one in Chad, then of course I will always revert and try to have a good balance between contemporary and between the historical. So thank you for joining me today, African History Club. Feel free to share and invite others to join us as we continue looking at Africa's past, Africa's present, and trying to analyze the possibilities for Africa's future. Thank you so much. Stay well and see you soon.